really see.
You look great.
Okay, great. Good.
All right, folks, it is the pregame show. And so we got about a minute and a half before we go live. Uh, um, we've got GDF. Do you want to introduce everybody?
Sure. We have as guest host Ev Gaumond and Alicia Wanless, and then we also have Glen McGregor joining us this evening. I'm very excited to discuss.
Yes, we're going to learn all about Canadian truckers, which was not a subject I thought we were deficient in information, but it turns out. All right.
And their remarkable fundraising abilities.
Yeah. All right, let's do this thing. Blue Go Live button. We are at your disposal. Blue Go Live button is not turning blue. Give me just a second here.
Uh-oh, we got Glen turn.
We've got,
Glen, you turn. You're sideways for me. And I can't hear you.
Oh, you have turned to the side.
And your microphone's not on.
Let's, I don't know what that's about.
He's been living in Ottawa for the last, week and a half. I mean...
You know, we all get turned upside down by that sort of thing.
He actually went downtown and was doing, live streaming of what was going on. It was pretty intense.
All right, let's try that again. Whoops, Glen is gone again.
They speak French in Quebec, not Quebecois.
Yeah, we speak French. Some people like to call it, the French people like to say it's a different language, but it's just French with an accent, with small.
I was reading a comic.
Yeah, I've seen it too. Oh, I wonder if we're going to speak Quebecois by the end of the day. I don't think so. Maybe you'll speak bad English.
Just teach them tabernacle.
All right, so I don't know what is wrong with the YouTube feed, but it is not working today. So I am going to just notify our YouTube feed. The YouTube feed seems to be down today. Come join us on Crowdcast! ! And we're going to just send them the Crowdcast link and get started. All right, Glen is we got to resolve the
Glen's got some connectivity issues, yeah.
Who's typing?
Hi.
Keep yourself muted when you're typing. All right, we're going to... Well, we've lost Glen entirely now. Sorry, folks. Can you hear us? He's bouncing in and out. We're going to try this. Sorry, folks. Bear with us.
Everybody bringing in their French for you, Ed.
The audio is very... it sounds like you're speaking to me from the depths of Hades. Very deep.
Oh, I am.
I'm going to try and refresh this again. I apologize.
Okay, we can hear you just fine.
The truckers are blocking Glen's feed.
Yes, we have Russian interference. All right, well, why don't we get started? And Glen will pop in when he's able, and we will do our best. All right, so I don't have to click the blue Go Live button. I can just start. So, and we're live. It is Wednesday, February 9th, 2022, 5:03 p.m. We are 3 minutes late, as you all very well know, because of technical difficulties. We have a guest host today, the estimable Eve Gaumond, who has the monologue today. Eve, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ben. So, let's talk about Olympism, actually. As a Canadian, it is Winter Olympics, and as a Canadian, I should be super happy about that. And I used to be super happy about that, but I'm not anymore, actually. I didn't follow it at all. I don't know if it's because it is in China, and like, oh, yeah, cool, not so cool, China. Or it's because we're in the middle of a pandemic. And that's so cool to gather all countries together because of that. But I figured out this morning, speaking with Ben, that the key to bring back my enthusiasm regarding Olympism should be to bring back a sport that we used to have here in Quebec, which is downhill skating. So yeah, I invite all of you to go.
What is downhill skating?
Yeah, so it's financed by Red Bull. They're building big course into cities. They light it up, and they ask hockey player to just go downhill very quick, and like they push each other, and they try to finish first. So yeah, it's basically a mix between cross, like I don't know how you call it in, like snowboarding with like jumps and all of stuff, and skating. So yeah, it's
basically like a combination of bobsledding and snowboarding and ice skating.
Yeah,
a little roller derby thrown in there too, it sounds like. I'm very interested in this.
So the videos are super cool, and you used to have some in St. Paul, I think. There used to be some courses and some races in the United States as well, and they're doing it in France on la Côte d'Azur. So yeah, many places around the world doing such competitions.
Ruth Anna is bringing up exactly what I'm thinking. I'm remembering the Paris team where they were doing a side-by-side spin and his skate went into her head. She did come back and skate later, not that day. And that's all I can think about in this is all of the injuries that I've witnessed in figure skating.
Are you for these injuries, Ev?
Oh yeah, I'm all for blood. I'm very, very pro-blood and injuries.
All right. So we are pro-blood, vicious Canadians, and
we just like a little color on the snow. That's all.
And we are not allowed to have fun anymore.
Cherry ice.
We are working to bring back Glen, who is having technical difficulties, which I am trying to resolve. But we are here to talk about bloodthirsty Canadian truckers. So, Alicia, get us started. What is going on in Ottawa, and why are Americans all of a sudden talking about Canadian politics for the first time ever?
That's actually rather sad. I'll just say that from the start. I really need Glen to come back because I know he'll be a much better introducer on this topic. But nearly a couple of weeks ago, a protest arrived that had been traveling across the country as part of a convoy for freedom to come and protest basically mandates. They like to say that they are not anti-vax, but it started with an anti-vax issue. There was, you may know that we have the longest undefended border in the world and a lot of cross-border traffic because we're utterly dependent on Americans to bring us supplies. And the Canadian government issued about a week before a mandate that all truckers crossing the border would have to be vaccinated. This is something that the Americans are doing as well. And then this started this protest against that. It's a tiny, tiny portion of overall truckers, and the Canadian Trucking Association says that it is a non-problem, that these guys, you know, that the vaccination is a problem. So anyway, they kind of amalgamated this trucker, I'm going to do trucker in quotation marks because it isn't a lot of trucks. I actually got to see the convoy coming in on the Friday before they arrived in Ottawa because they passed near where I live, and I was stupid enough to go into the next city. There were people, which shocked me, on all of the overpasses all the way in, and this is like a rural environment, who were supporting them. The vast majority of vehicles that I saw going in were like pickup trucks with Canadian flags, and I get to swear on this show. Oh, so, yeah. Fuck Trudeau flags, like in black, white, red, and white, which reminds me as a propaganda scholar of other things. And also like hanging off the back, which reminded me a little bit of a different group in the Middle East. And so then they converged at our local truck stop. So I went by and looked at that, and it was also a really weird hodgepodge. Anyway, long story short, they get up in Ottawa. They start blockading streets with their vehicles. They're not the biggest protest that ever happened in terms of numbers, but because of the machinery that they've been bringing in to block the streets, it takes up a lot more space. And they have been honking their horns pretty much day and night. They're really decamped. They had actual structures that they brought in, wooden structures in parks to feed and supply everybody. They put bouncy castles up and saunas. And then they proceeded to harass the local community in the downtown core of Ottawa, which is pretty interesting because the city knew it was coming and did nothing. The provincial government did nothing. And our prime minister got COVID. And so he went into isolation in the midst of all of it. And on the first couple of days, we saw Nazi symbols, swastikas drawn on Canadian flags, Confederate flag. In the last couple of days, we've seen pro-Trump flags. Apparently Trump is going to become our next prime minister. And a lot of harassment of minority groups. So women, people of color, LGBTQ, a lot of harassment there. And the pinnacle has been the attempted burning of an entire apartment building, which is under investigation. Really hope Glen is coming in because his details will be a lot better.
Yeah, so I am working on getting Glen in and failing. So, Glen, can you, if you're seeing this, can you say something in the chat so that I can make sure I'm getting the right person? So
I see you. He sees us.
Where did you just see him?
I saw him in the chat. He says, I see you.
Where is I see you?
Beneath Jonathan Ruttenberg and above Rob in Maryland.
Gross.
What so that's kind of it. And what we've kind of...
Oh, wait. There he is. Okay. Wait. All right. I at least know I have invited the right person. So, Ev, this threatened to spread to other places in Canada, and there was even a sort of abortive thing in Quebec City. Tell us about the Quebec convoy version of this.
Yeah, so exactly. People very passionate about what was happening in Ottawa. Decided one guy who was a former association guy in the sector of construction decided that he would lead his own convoy going to Quebec City, and he managed to bring 500 big trucks, 500 trucks in the city of Quebec. But given that we knew what was happening in Ottawa, the mayor and the premier here, they did a pretty good job at containing them. They controlled their arrivals. So as soon as they were getting in the city, they were taking their license and making sure that everyone was it was clear who everyone was. They were asking them to park their trucks. They're allowed 2 trucks to get close to the National Assembly. All of the other trucks had to be parked. They were giving tickets when the honking was too loud. So it lasted one day, and they were only allowed to protest by foot, like walking around the National Assembly. and it was cold. It's Quebec. So after one day at 5 o'clock on Saturday, most of them were gone. But when I went there, I walked a bit around, and I realized that there was something off. It was not our normal protest. It was like there were many English messages, which is not completely usual in Quebec. And this is where I texted Alicia, actually, and I think that she had some interesting stuff to say about that. I'm not completely sure. It is like, of course, there are people who are upset about the rules. We have vaccine mandates and like many regulations around COVID. So yeah, there are people who are upset about that. But it doesn't seem like genuinely coming from them. I think that there's some sort of influence, or actually, yeah. So that was my feeling, and apparently, my feeling was not too wrong.
Right. So let's talk about that, Alicia. What's your? And I'm still working on Glen.
You're
muted.
Sorry. What? So let's talk about that while I keep working on Glen. I'm trying to multitask here, and the result is that I end up muted when I'm talking. What do we know about the cross-border nature of this? How Canadian are these Canadian patriots?
I mean, I think a lot of them are Canadian. It's a weird hodgepodge of a group. So you have this small minority of truckers involved. You've definitely got far-right elements that have been labeled as the key organizers of this. Like they've had past instances where they've belied some far-right sentiments. Then you also have kind of anarchists and far-right, or like evangelicals. The other thing that's pretty interesting to me, listening to the people talking in Ottawa, and also some of my own friends who are very supportive of it, you've got a lot of rural Canadians, and then Eastern Europeans Canadians, like people who have moved here, and that to me has been interesting. There was a Polish bakery that was supplying them with food. But this is kind of, it makes sense because there's this whole element of not wanting to be told what to do coming out of, former communist countries. And then you do likely have some Americans. You definitely have Americans funding it, because you had politicians in Texas complaining when the GoFundMe campaign went down, which was one of the largest GoFundMe campaigns in its history. And when GoFundMe decided that this was not acceptable and that there was violence being spread and stuff, they shut it down and said that they were going to contact people to give the money back. So then they moved to another platform that's well known among the far right, and they raised, like, within 2 or 3 days, another 6 or 7 million.
And that's on top of the 10 million that they had in GoFundMe. So that's 16 million total.
The 10 million's gone. That all goes back to the people who donated. And now the recap was that. Now, what happened was you had some Texas politicians weighing in on Twitter complaining because Texans were giving money to it. But beyond that, in the last couple of days, there was another news article that came out that found that a woman's account, a Facebook account, I think she was in Missouri, who her account had been hacked on Facebook, and it was being used to organize all of these groups on Facebook and run the fundraising behind it. Wow. And so there's a lot of question over, like, who's actually behind it, how many Americans are in it. But one thing I would like to say is there's this really great book called American Nations, who the author is escaping me right now. But it has this theory that really you have different nations within North America, and they actually spread across the border. And so you have this kind of like Midwest, Montana jutting up to Alberta and Saskatchewan. And that mentality is a lot more similar than, say, people in Ontario or the East Coast coming down the East Coast. And so I think we take for granted, well, I think Canadians are well aware of how you influence us. We see it all the time. We have your media nonstop. You're just not as aware of that interconnectivity. I mean, you never notice our good actors or singers, just the bad ones.
I don't know. Ryan Reynolds is pretty great. But the one thing that I did want to just quickly touch on is I actually, as an American, had to refresh myself of Canadian geography where the cities were. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting, considering the complaining from certain Texas politicians about disrupting peaceful protesting, it did not sound all that peaceful. But one of the solutions that seems to have been implemented in Quebec is that the actual just utilization of laws that are already existing and systems that are already implemented to control bad actors and just like civil society seem to be pretty successful. So how much of that was just a lack of preparation, in your opinion, for Ottawa? Or was it just kind of, we're not taking this group too seriously?
Nice question.
Sorry.
I think there's a bunch of things that are at play here. One is that I think that the Ottawa police, it would appear, if we're going to believe social media posts and things that come out, that the Ottawa police has a lot of sympathizers who don't see it as problematic and actually support them. There was one instance of an officer who actually had her uniform on, and it looked like she was sitting in her car, her cruiser, like doing a live video about her support for it. There's other things that Glenn, if we can get him back in here, could talk about. He covered that, of like police helping
working
them
on it.
Yeah, I know. Giving them advice of how to get their jerry cans of gas filled. And also just like bringing them coffee and things like that. So there's a huge question as to whether the Ottawa police really wanted to do anything. Now, the line that they took was, we're taking a de-escalation approach to this. But I have another friend, Micah Clark, who did a good thread on this on Twitter. And one of the things that he said is, for de-escalation to work, they have to have an actual articulated aim of what they want, which they don't. If you read their agenda, it's pretty incoherent. The second thing is they have to believe in authority and the legitimacy of those powers to negotiate with them, which they don't. Then the second thing about all of that is that Centertown, and Tim Aubrey is a good one to watch on this as well. Centertown, which is the downtown core, and other parts that it's spilling over to in like Vanier, are really widely neglected by the Ottawa City Council. For a long time, the mayor has had this approach that has focused more on the suburbs and outer areas and like just neglected that downtown core. So there's a little bit here at play that makes me wonder whether this is just another extension of that they didn't care, they didn't believe them, that some of them are supporters. And then the other peculiar thing about Ottawa is that Parliament Hill is not technically like provincial or this capital's jurisdiction. It is part of the NCC, the National Capital Commission. And so you've got this, and that's the RCMP that would deal with that. But then the outer area of it would be the Ottawa Police Force. And so you have this multiple layering of governmental jurisdictions that make it really challenging sometimes to operate. But that's not an excuse, because every level of government was absent, it seems, from the municipal to the provincial to the federal leader.
Now, I just want to say that this would never happen in the United States, because we have the Capitol Police. And, you know, if you tried to disrupt downtown Washington, that would never be tolerated or okay, because we have this, you know, these elite forces that make sure that you cannot disrupt government business in Washington, D.C.
Hey, Jen, lasted a day, right? Like we're into like the second week. And back to the laws. They did break a whole bunch of bylaws, but then they said, oh, there's too many of them and we're too understaffed to do anything about it. And then a couple of days ago, they said they would enforce, and there's really big questions of whether they are enforcing. And then there was a court order. There was a court order that they could no longer honk their horns at night. And that also, I've heard from friends living downtown, that hasn't lasted.
It doesn't work? I was quite enthusiastic when I saw they got the injunction, but you say that it doesn't work?
Well, they don't. So the thing is, this hodgepodge of protesters doesn't really seem to believe in the legitimacy of the government or the courts. However, there are two things that they keep harping on, which is like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, saying that this is all infringing if they can't have their protest. And lately, they've been pointing to the Geneva Convention, that preventing them from getting gas is against the Geneva Convention.
Wow.
Yeah, I just want to say, last I checked, there is neither a state of occupation nor a state of armed conflict, domestic or international, in Ottawa, but maybe we should revisit that conclusion.
kind of in this vein. Oh, I'm sorry, Ben, please.
So
I don't think we're getting Glen. Alas.
Glen is. I am failing utterly to bring Glen on the screen, and I want to apologize to Glen for that. So here is what I'm going to do. Glen, if you can hear me, which I think you can, call Alicia on your phone, and we will at least, and Alicia, put him on speakerphone, and we will at least get his voice.
Yeah, 1 second. I'm just going to text him my number. It's on Twitter. I'm sending it to you on Twitter, private messenger.
So I am going to mute Alicia while we set that up. And apologies to everybody, particularly Glen, for that. So I want to ask the question that I think is on everybody's mind, which is related to the matter that Alicia was referring to before, which is this kind of cross-border far-right interplay. And I want to trace a little bit of history for a second, and if you have thoughts on it. So it seems to me we had the Tea Party in the United States. A few months later, you guys had Rob Ford in Ontario, in Toronto, which has a real pre-Trump-like quality to it. Then, and we don't notice, of course, Rob Ford in the United States, except in the sense that, you know, there's occasional jokes about crack smoking Toronto mayor. It all seems very U.S. And then we kind of get Trump, which is sort of Rob Ford on steroids, or maybe we shouldn't have drug jokes about Rob Ford. And then you guys have Doug Ford, his brother, and then there's kind of January 6th, and now there's this. So it does feel like we're having a kind of weird cross-border far-right dialogue. And Ev, I'm curious what you think is that, like, first of all, where is Quebec in that? Are you guys just, like, your own thing that doesn't play in those waters? Or, and secondly, like, you know, should we be blaming Canada for all the far-right stuff? Because, you know, we look over the border and actually you're like a month ahead of us.
On the second question, I don't know that I can answer. On the first one, I can, though. Well, no, Quebec is not outside of this at all. Actually, there's the Populist Party, which is a Canadian party, which is led by a guy, Maxime Bernier, who likes to call himself Mad Max. Was a former minister when it was Stephen Harper who was the prime minister. He was defense minister. He was under many scandals because he was not particularly competitive, like good at it. He left. Well, another comparison, possible link between United States and Canada. He left some important documents in the car, and in his like girlfriend's car, and it was like private information and like national security information. So not so dissimilar to what you're experiencing now with Donald Trump leaving with documents. Well, so yeah, this guy is actually fighting vaccine mandate. He's deep down into conspiracy and far right. And he is more likely to be elected elsewhere in the country than in Quebec, where his actual writing is not very much into it to him anymore. His father used to be MP of this riding. Then he has been member of this. He has been deputy of this riding. But since he founded his own party, he's not able to be elected anymore. So yeah, and for the second question, I'm letting Alicia answer as to, are we influencing the United States?
We have Glen. I hope you can hear me.
Glen, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Sorry about all the technical problems with grumbles in the system.
Nope.
Can you hear him?
Yeah, we can hear you. Speak loudly and slowly, and Alicia, when he's speaking, hold him up to the microphone, okay?
Where's the microphone?
Just your computer.
I'm here.
Or,
it's here.
Yeah, excellent. Don't show his number, though, because then the truckers are all going to start texting him. All right, so Glenn, let's start with what you can tell us about who these people are, how many of them are there, and how indigenous to Canada is it, and how much of it is actually U.S. influenced? Is this us sending you our worst, or is this your own problem?
Yeah, we're not sure. And I think Alicia and Eve covered it off really well, so set up what exactly is happening here. But if you sort of rewind the tape back to 2016, I think a lot of Canadians looked on with puzzlement at what was happening with the election, with your presidential election, and then a lot of them were frankly horrified at what happened in the ensuing 4 years. I mean, we had public opinion polls in Canada about what Canadians thought of Donald Trump, and it was overwhelmingly negative. So we didn't think that kind of political sentiment existed in Canada. And so what we've been confronted with over the past couple of weeks is really kind of surprising a lot of people, because it seems to be a lot of those kind of sentiments now expressed through this movement that has been channeled, as Lisa explained, at the beginning with resistance to what was kind of a fairly narrow piece of public policy, that is the vaccination of requirement for truckers who drive across the Canada-U.S. border. And it's a very relatively small number of people in the tens of thousands who work in the trucking industry and who have not been vaccinated. And also, the policy point from a Canadian perspective is kind of neat, because the U.S., a week after we imposed our own requirement, the U.S. put theirs in place. So that means that theoretically, if Canada didn't have the requirement, truckers could come from the United States into Canada, but they couldn't go back into the U.S. Without having to face potential 14-day quarantine, which would effectively mean they couldn't do their jobs. So to your question, though, Ben, about who these people are, there is a component, absolutely, of those people. I've spoken to truckers out on the streets of Ottawa who have essentially lost their livelihoods because, for whatever reason, they decided they didn't want to get vaccinated, and they can't drive their rigs across the United States, which is represents a great deal of their business, because there's an enormous amount of Canada-U.S. cross-border trade. And you're seeing how big that is as the truck protest moves from Ottawa, as it did a couple of days ago, to Detroit and to Windsor, Ontario, Detroit, Michigan, are connected by the Ambassador Bridge. It is, I believe it is the busiest border crossing, certainly in North America and possibly the world. Literally hundreds of millions of dollars of goods going back and forth there every week. And it's really key to the auto sectors, which in Canada, our auto sector is highly integrated with yours, particularly in Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, but also in other places in southern Ontario. And the problem is, we've heard a lot of concern about supply chain during the pandemic. And one of the initial arguments that the truckers gave, who are supporting this movement, was that requiring them to be vaccinated, some of them won't drive, and that will cut off the supply chain. We have this whole week of people posting pictures from their grocery stores showing the empty shelves in places. Turns out that wasn't really the issue. There's bad weather, and the supply chain has been affected, of course, by the pandemic just generally. But the problem that's happening, you see at the Ambassador Bridge, this parallel protest to where I am in Ottawa, is that trucks can't get across. And because the automotive is such a just-in-time delivery industry, that we're now facing potential temporary plant closures on both sides of the border because the parts aren't moving back and forth. And that's going to mean workers are going to lose shifts, they're going to lose wages. The unions that represent auto workers are upset about it, and it's become quite a issue down there. But let me just continue on to your point, and I'm sorry I'm rambling here, but to who the group is that is protesting here in Ottawa. So that, yes, there are those truckers, but there are also people who are pretty fed up with COVID mandates in general. They don't like the fact that they have to be vaccinated to fly domestically on a Canadian flight or travel by train, which is another one of those provisions that the federal government put in place. And there's also a smaller little component of people who wouldn't normally align with these groups, and they are mostly women. I found mostly younger women and a lot of moms who have a personal aversion to the idea. So they're kind of into alternative medicine, naturopathy, things like that, and they are also kind of represented here. And then you have kind of another branch of this, which is people who just are politically opposed to the Trudeau government. They don't like him. They revile him. And this is another channel for them. So it's by no means a homogeneous group. There's a lot of different interests here, but it's all kind of coalesced in the last 2 weeks into this movement. And also, interesting point about it is they've really kind of tried to, well, because they claim they are reflecting Canada, the sentiments of Canadians in general, which polling shows isn't true because an overwhelming percentage of Canadians are actually vaccinated. Some are up at over 80% fully vaccinated, and over 50% have gotten the third booster shot. But they also try and position themselves as a representative of the working class too, because trucking is a working industry, and you've also seen farmers come out, and so it really is, Ben, and I'll shut up now, kind of a really disparate mixed group.
So, Glenn, I'm just curious, specifically about just more the working class sentiment and how you think that perhaps their sentiments towards the protest and the mandates could change, or what kind of situation do you see, especially when we get into those real world effects of there being physical and financial ramifications for the protest, especially within that group? Do you think that would be enough to change the sentiment, or do you think that it's just comes down to an ideology that's just opposed to mandates at this point?
Yeah, and I'm not going to stipulate that this group truly does represent the working class. And I mean, Eve will certainly know this in Canada. The working class has typically, well, at least until recently, has aligned with a party called the New Democrats. They were this party of the left, the conservative movement, formerly the progressive conservative, that in the 1990s morphed into a sort of a Western alienation party and then kind of reconfigured itself as the conservatives now. They've been on the right side, and the liberals have been more of a centrist party. Those things have shifted a lot recently, and I think it kind of reflects what you saw in the United States with Trump, his appeal to working class and rural voters, that the federal conservatives here in Canada are now seeing that as an accessible group. And Eve mentioned also the People's Party of Canada, which essentially it's a very fringe party. They failed to elect a single member of the legislature in the last elections. But the federal conservatives want to bring those people back into their tent for electoral gain. One of the effects of this has been a cleavage in the last week within the Conservative Party. In fact, they just dumped their leader, who lost the last election back in the fall, in part because of his sort of middle-of-the-road response to these protests. You had a lot of members of parliament, these are like our congressmen, going out and taking photos with the protesters on the street in front of Parliament Hill, which is, of course, their workplace. And that caused some division in the party because people who are more centrist in the party, including the then leader, Erin O'Toole, were less comfortable with that. And then there was kind of a little bit of a putsch inside the Conservative Party, and his members of his parliamentary caucus, the MPs, our congressional equivalents, decided to vote him out as leader and replace him with an interim leader who had been very vocal in her support of the truckers and had seen it, according to a leaked email that she had sent, as a way, as kind of a political wedge to put the problem on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Our reporting shows that in a meeting with some of the leaders of that parliamentary group, she actually even repeated the phrase, good people on both sides, an echo of the very fine people on both sides, of course, that your former president had used after the Charlottesville Unite the Right rallies. It's a party divided now, and we don't know if a more centrist candidate is going to come forward and try and take control of it. And I've wandered off from the point about the working class, but it's fair to say that conservatives believe they can bring more working class voters and just kind of disaffected people of the kind. We don't really have an equivalent of hillbilly elegy here in Canada. Our lowest incomes aren't as low as yours, and but there's still a constituency like there that I think some conservatives feel they can court electorally. And this protest that we're seeing here is really we're meeting a lot of these people here in Ottawa and listening to them and seeing that they are, although they are a small number in Ottawa and they grossly overinflate their estimate of their actual size, there's clearly a constituency here for this. And it's going to be a factor in Canadian politics until the next election, for sure.
Can I just jump in? Is that okay? Glenn, I now want to bring up the last time that the Conservatives had elected a leader, and wasn't the kingmaker in that contest quite frighteningly to the far right? Do you know who I'm talking about? The lawyer from Toronto, which was also odd because she was from Toronto.
Yes, right. So, So in the last leadership race for the party,
yes.
Not the last prime minister, but the last leadership race that elected Aaron O'Toole, and I'll tell you, Aaron O'Toole is a mid-50s guy. He was a corporate lawyer before. He's a military veteran. He was a navigator on search and rescue helicopters. He was kind of considered a relatively centrist guy, although he did kind of come from the Stephen Harper lineage, which was the former Conservative Prime Minister who managed to put together a 9-year term in power before he lost to Justin Trudeau. So in the leadership race, Aaron O'Toole had to kind of campaign for that job, that top job at the party, from a more right-wing, stronger conservative position, particularly on social issues, which is still a very reactive constituency for that party. Although abortion rights are pretty much a settled issue here. And one of the candidates who ran against him was a lawyer from Toronto named Leslyn Lewis, who was a black woman, and that was attractive for a party that has had trouble getting votes from ethnic communities. And she had sort of this meteoric rise. She hadn't been a member of parliament before, which is usually the traditional path towards becoming leader. And she was kind of a kingmaker in that. O'Toole's main rival in that race was a guy who had been in the Harper cabinet as defense minister and justice minister named Peter MacKay. He was the son of a guy who had been a cabinet minister in the Brian Mulroney government from the 1980s, a progressive conservative government. So he had this kind of like political lineage, and that was kind of an upset because MacKay was considered a centrist, was very experienced. There was stories in the U.S. press ridiculously suggesting some kind of flirtation that he had when he was, I believe, foreign minister with Condoleezza Rice. So he was a handsome guy, rugby player, but the support of Leslyn Lewis, this up-and-coming lawyer who was very well liked with the strong social conservative types that for people for whom abortion rights are still an issue, that really put O'Toole over the top. And so then when he went into the last election campaign, you still have to, like in the U.S., the center is where the votes are. He presented a much more centrist election platform, was open to climate change legislation, but ultimately failed. The Liberals have a very well-oiled electoral machine. Justin Trudeau at that point had run 2 election campaigns successfully. He was a much more experienced leader, and O'Toole lost. And that is one thing a lot of conservative supporters can't abide, is losing an election, especially to Justin Trudeau.
Yeah. So just to bring the ball home, just to bring the point back, so we're at the moment the Conservative Party doesn't have yeah. Are you good? So at the moment we don't have a leader for the Conservative Party. According to you, what are the chances that we end up with a far right leader or a more centrist like O'Toole? Are we at risk of having a Trumpian figure at the head of the Conservative Party, or are we good to have one sensible person?
Did you catch that? Because my internet broke up quite a bit. I can repeat.
Yeah, I think it's not the substance of the question. Okay. Whether we like to have a Trump-like leader of the Conservative Party in Canada. I don't think we'll ever have anyone that far out of kind of mainstream Canadian values, but the leading contender to replace Aaron O'Toole is a young MP from the Ottawa area who represents a rural riding named Pierre Poliver. He is an experienced politician. He had held a relatively junior cabinet post under Stephen Harper, and then in opposition was kind of the guy who would kind of put the stick in the House of Commons, very aggressive questioning. And he's has very much aligned himself with the trucker protests. He is definitely campaigning from a much more conservative position than others in the party. And he's also from Ontario, which is interesting because the Conservative Party, the modern Conservative Party, is now kind of amalgam of sort of Western interests. So Saskatchewan, Alberta, which is a bit like our Texas, and British Columbia, compared to the more centrist business Bay Street or Wall Street representation from Ontario Conservative MPs who tended to be sort of a little more red or Tories, as they call them. So he's from Ontario, but he is much more of a conservative, and he is the person to beat at this point. He's already declared that he's going to run for the leadership, and no one else has formally declared yet. But there is still groups within the party that would like to see a more centrist leader. There's a guy from Southern Ontario named Michael Chong. Is an Asian Canadian and very moderate, and he has spoken out against the protests in the House of Commons, saying it's time to go home, while respecting their rights to protest freely and also understanding their concerns about vaccination mandates. He's kind of staked out different ground. So, I mean, this is the fascinating thing about the story, and I've been covering it for 15 days straight, is that not only are these kind of social issues playing out, there's medical health issues playing out, but the immediate future of the main rival, our equivalent of the minority party in Congress, is being determined in large part by the reactions to the trucker protest. And we don't really know how it's going to play out. Like this thing could go on for a long time. And there's been talk about possible military intervention that they would bring in the police. And that's a whole interesting other subject with respect to the Prime Minister and his personal history with this, that weighs kind of the constitutional rights to protest against privacy against public safety and the needs, the rights of people in their communities.
So I want to ask you, but also Alicia and Ev, there's a temptation from a U.S. perspective to look at this and say, okay, the truckers kind of map on to the MAGA people. They even say fuck Trudeau, which sounds a lot like, fuck Joe Biden or let's go Brandon. Trudeau is a kind of particularly good-looking Joe Biden figure, but is a kind of a similar, occupies a similar position in the political spectrum. And then you have a conservative movement that is in some disarray as it kind of veers between traditionalism and traditional conservatives and this kind of populist conservatism. And so my question is, how good is that kind of one-to-one mapping of American political spectrum onto the modern Canadian spectrum, leaving out Quebec, sorry, for now. But that's just kind of its own thing. And to what extent is that facile and misses an important, or other than Quebec, important elements of the Canadian political ecosystem?
This to me, I would say it's kind of an easy comparison to do that mapping. I'm not sure that it's completely accurate. Justin Trudeau is a much further left political leader and governs much further left than Joe Biden. That's just, the Canadian values are, even a lot of conservative supporters, were you to map them into the United States, would very likely be Democrats. So it doesn't quite work that exactly that way. But Justin Trudeau, perhaps because he's so good, I don't know. He triggers a response among certain political opponents, and conservatives in particular, that I hadn't seen any other prime minister, perhaps save for his father, has provoked, and they really don't like him. The ridicule, the mockery of him is very strong, and they got a lot of ammunition 2 elections ago when it came out in the middle of the election campaign that he had worn blackface on several occasions. This is a guy who, part of his political mantra is massive outreach to racialized groups, to Indigenous groups. Reconciliation with Indigenous people is very important to him. So this was what we thought was going to be in the middle of an election campaign. And keep in mind, these are short election campaigns, only 36 days. We thought that was going to be a death blow for him, because it was the optics of that were, above all else, the offense he caused by wearing blackface, not once but repeatedly, was so serious. But also, we thought it was going to be politically toxic to him, and yet somehow he survived that election. But the MAGA conservatives you're talking about from the United States, I don't think, until now, we didn't think they really mapped on to that large a share of the Conservative Party. But now we're assessing, because what we're seeing here, not just because of the numbers of people on here or the virulence and of their opinion and how dedicated they are to this, but it's clearly getting a lot of support across the country. I saw a poll today that said only 32% of Canadians support. I think it's about 67% of Canadians generally disapprove of the protests, but 32% either somewhat or very much support it. So that is not some small, as Trudeau called them, a small fringe minority, and that the protesters have really glommed onto that slogan, and I've seen them wearing T-shirts with it. And it's been likened to Hillary Clinton's line dismissing Trump supporters as deplorables, in the same way that MAGA people adopted that as kind of a badge of honor. You're seeing some of these truckers pick up on that small fringe minority line as well, and it clearly isn't a small fringe minority. There is it's a minority, but it's not a small fringe, and so I think what we're learning from this protest is that there is a political market for that, and what we don't know is whether it's going to be electorally palatable, so that when Canadians go to the polls, likely within the next year or two, because we have a minority government that could fall at any time, that's going to be a road test of that. So if the Conservative Party chooses a leader who is more aligned with that viewpoint, we don't know if that is going to connect, if he's going to be able to sell that at the same time he reaches out to the traditional Conservative base, particularly in Ontario, where all the electoral districts are that they need to win, or whether that will offend Ontario voters, because that's a much more ethnically diverse province, especially the seats that are always in play are very ethnically diverse. and we don't know if that's going to offend them or if that new leader, whoever he or she may be, can unite that MAGA Canada movement with traditional conservative base. And if he can or she can, Conservatives will win the election handily, because people are just generally like to throw out leaders after 3 or 4 elections, or 2 or 3 elections in Canada anyway. And Trudeau is on kind of a limited, the number of times he can go back and run again may be limited by his own party. So it's a big question mark, and I'll let Alicia and Eve fill in the rest of it.
I actually think that this has been a long time in the coming. I grew up in rural Anglo-Canada and saw that there were sentiments that were swinging right long before this. Then moving to Ottawa and working there for a Conservative senator, one thing that really struck me was the lack of understanding for rural Canadians and their viewpoints, and I think disregarding whatever they had to say, or saying that they would never actually go that far right. So there's that. The second thing is that Trudeau, I don't think ever really won because of him or his own right. He was like a choice that was better than the other options. And that's kind of like, I think, how it panned out when he called an election in the pandemic too. Like he didn't actually get his majority at all. And then the third thing is coming back to some research that I'd done. So I had been following your election in the US and came up with a model of participatory propaganda, looking at how Trump kind of was elected in the communities that supported him. And one thing that really struck me back then was how organized they were and how good they were at engaging audiences to become propagandists themselves. So then in 2017, I did the same type of study comparing left and right in Canada. And what I found was that we had Facebook pages like Canada Proud, Ontario Proud, that were super active. And by the time the next election came in Ontario, these guys had outstripped engagement and followings more so than the candidates themselves. And they continue to operate and push things. And some of the things, I dropped a link in there earlier, some of the things that they were saying back in 2017 was like, Trump should be our prime minister, and advocating for it. And so there's a
you
part-
can have him anytime.
Alberta and Saskatchewan
sure
can just go off with Montana and take Trump with them. But what I'm trying to say is that what I always found really jarring coming to work in Ottawa is that there is kind of a liberal elite that does disregard, rural Canadians who are conservative. And now we see them kind of resurging, following methods that Americans have really kind of perfected, sadly. But we do also have the left now responding that way too. So it's going to get interesting and ugly, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I mean, I think you got to remember the Conservative Party of today is an amalgam of what was called the Reform Party, which was basically a Western Canadian-based protest movement that was much more conservative socially, economically, and but they were not electorally viable. They could never win power, so they had to reform as this modern Conservative Party, trying to unite with Quebec, because there's a lot of votes in Quebec, and in particular Ontario. And Stephen Harper, previous prime minister, successfully did that. He reformed the party. He was its first leader, and he stayed in power for 9 years. The thing about importing some of the tactics and strategies from the United States, that's absolutely the case. The social media of the trucker protesters is enormous. They are very active, and they use it very effectively. And the other thing they've imported, and this is something that I have to deal with on a daily, is they've taken the fake news idea from the United States, and they are absolutely allergic to what they call the mainstream media. So much so that we've had to change the way because the television network, we have to send cameras into the field to cover this protest. We've had to change the way we do that, because the aggression and the hostility that we face from the people who are in the crowd, and part of this is kind of a mob situation. You get a group of people together, they do things and act towards journalists in a way that they wouldn't one-on-one. But it's been, I gotta say, covering it, I've never covered anything like this. I've had people, I'm trying to do my on-cam stand-ups at the end of the night and out on the street, and people coming up and yelling obscenities in my ear. And they all pull out their phones and start recording us to make sure we're telling the truth. And they repeatedly call us fake news. The other night I had and this rattled me a little, I have to say, because I'm used to, people not liking journalists. That's an occupational hazard. But there was a man carrying a small child on his shoulders who came up and stood behind me when I was trying to do my stand-up in front of a camera. And he was in the shot, and then he moved off. And then when he found out which news network we were affiliated with, then he yelled like an obscenity at me. Nothing I don't hear in my newsroom every day, but it just really kind of rattled me a little that this guy was so angry and so distrustful of the media that he would act that way with a child, possibly his child, on his shoulders. So that, and of course, this is something American journalists have been dealing with since 2016, and so it's not new down there, but it is new here, and all news organizations that are covering this protest are trying to adapt to that and find ways to do it in a less confrontational way and a way that keeps. I wouldn't say it's safe because no one's been physically hurt, but it's very disruptive when you're trying to work and that's happening to you. So again, another kind of thing that came from the United States.
All right. Well, with apologies for our exports, we are going to go to audience questions. We only have a few minutes, so quick questions and quick answers. And to our questioners, please direct your questions to one of the guests. Richard, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, I guess I want to pick up on Glen's mentions. Since we're talking about exports of some sort, and I'm wondering if the protests are having a significant negative effect on the attitudes of some Canadians towards the U.S., and is there any meaningful likelihood of this sparking some sort of nationalist backlash against the U.S., something that a political candidate could actually use effectively in the near future?
No, I don't think so. I mean, Canadians, we're often described as the mouse that sleeps next to the elephant. Canadians absorb American culture constantly. We travel back and forth across the border. Something like 80% of us live within about 100 miles of the U.S. border. We see Canada considers ourselves to be the United States' closest neighbor. And that's why I say there was puzzlement when we saw what was happening in 2016 with the rise of the MAGA movement. But also Canadians also have a kind of a view of the United States that even though you're very much like us culturally, there's some things we find strange. Your failure to adopt a nationalized single-payer government-run healthcare system as we have in Canada is for a great number of Canadians a real head scratcher because our healthcare system is something we're very proud of, although it's been extremely taxed by the pandemic and some of the cracks in the system are showing through, chiefly that it's just not funded enough. We have spent a lot more money on it, and we also a lot of Canadians don't really understand how widespread gun ownership is in the United States and the amount of gun crime you have, particularly when we see it on the news when there's a mass killing. That's something we see far less of in Canada. Rates of gun ownership are a lot lower here. But again, we have that constituency in Canada, particularly in rural Canada, particularly in Western Canada, that are much more aligned. Even have we don't really have anything equivalent to the NRA, but we have a fairly strong firearms lobby, and they are extremely adverse to the Trudeau government because he has brought in even further gun control rules, particularly or most recently after a gun massacre in Nova Scotia in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic. So, anyway, sorry, that was supposed to be a short answer. It wasn't.
I just want to add, though, see, this is the rural divide. Like, I grew up on a farm. We had rifles because you had to deal with rabid foxes, and we don't understand why you need to regulate that. Of course, automatic stuff is a little bit different.
I think, it's all about anti-tank missile rights. John Hawkinson, you get the last question today.
Well, this is really just a summary question of the entire show, but here it is anyway, and maybe you can wrap with it or tie a bow on it. And I think it's for Alicia, but maybe Ben wants to take it. Is this a sign that the degradation of the American experiment into polarization is a phenomenon just far more widespread than the United States? Obviously, the answer is yes, but what does it imply for how we can resolve it?
Alicia, what are your thoughts? I have a brief thought on this subject, but you're the information ecosystem person.
I think democracies the world over are in danger right now, given our inability to govern the information environment and really articulate what our values are for even intervening in it. So it isn't just an American problem, and it didn't start in America. I mean, look at Hungary and the UK. It's everywhere. Glenn?
I'm not sure I totally buy that premise. I mean, our politics in Canada and our culture reflects the United States in large parts, but I don't think it's the parallels map that easily. I have a colleague of mine, a Canadian who works in Washington, and every time he sees a story in Canada that resembles the United States, he always says, "Hey, Canada, get your own thing." So I think well, we kind of did here with the trucker protest, and I see the signs that it may actually be exported to the United States. Let's talk about a trucker convoy towards Washington. So we'll see. But we'll leave it at that.
I just want to say any truckers who want to try to come to Washington and navigate the streets here, you are welcome. Try getting out. We are going to leave it there. Glen, apologies for the technical difficulties. Thank you so much for joining us. I normally tell guests they're great Americans, but I can't tell you that. You're a great Canadian, as are you, Alicia Wanless. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be back on Friday. It is going to be Mike Chase playing Where's the Lie on In Lieu of Fun. I know a lot of you have been waiting for this because, you know, he's super funny and he's a good storyteller, and that's what you want in a Where's the Lie. So that's going to be 46 hours and 55 minutes from now. And until then, Eve Gaumond?
We're not allowed to have fun, but we're allowed to work together, Canadian and Americans, to protect democracy.
Indeed. And we're allowed to have very loud trucks. I didn't know there were trucks in Canada. You know, I'm just amazed by that. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.